So last time we left off in the middle of the medications section, or more like I would say kind of the beginning of the medications section. Last time we just started talking about half-lives. And we finished talking about half-lives because that's really all we were going to say is basically that the half-life is the amount of time that it takes for the concentration of a drug to be half of what it started as in your body. Now remember that this is important because if it is 50% of what it was, then another half-life will make it or I'm sorry, if it's 50% eliminated, the next half-life will make it 75% eliminated, and so on and so forth. So that number gets smaller and smaller and smaller with every concurrent half-life. So after 5 half-lives, generally speaking, that's the amount of time that you need for a drug to be completely eliminated from your system. And one thing that we mentioned last time was that just because 5 half-lives have passed doesn't necessarily mean that the longer term impacts of that substance on your system have been completely washed out. So an example of this is that I checked out a psilocybin study that's happening a couple days ago, and one of the requirements that they had was that you must stop taking whatever medication you're on. I think they specified SSRIs for 5 half-lives plus 2 weeks. So that's just an example of where that shows up pretty prominently in like studies, in recruitment, in understanding how interactions can work, because sometimes that can be a little bit subtle if you're not really aware of how that substance is going to be impacting your body short, long term. Okay, now we'll look at SSRIs. A huge percentage of people are on SSRIs. Wait, actually, we're not looking at SSRIs yet. This is just a general overview still. We haven't even hit that section. Okay. So a question that I get asked a lot is, how do I choose a medication? Because there are so many different ones. And the answer that I give is, why are you choosing your medication? Your prescriber, who spent like 20 billion years in med school, should probably be the one that knows which medication it is, which is just a beef that I have with the American healthcare system of advertising different products and basically making consumers feel confident in deciding which very powerful psychoactive medications are good for them. But that's a story for another day, or maybe even later in this day, but not at this moment in time. So the question of why did my friend get prescribed this and I get prescribed this is one that can have a bunch of different answers to it. And if any of you here, which I'm sure, like statistically, at least some of you have been prescribed SSRIs at some point in the past or currently. Like, I don't remember actually what the statistic is, but I think it's something insane, like 1 in 10 people are on an antidepressant right now. But I don't remember exactly what the statistic is. So if anyone knows it, please say so in the chat. So here are just some examples of this. We have probably the best known one out of these is fluoxetine or Prozac. And Prozac is the quintessential SSRI. It was the first one on the market. It was the one that revolutionized how we talked about, let me turn off flux, hang on. Revolutionized how we talked about depression, how we talked about mental health, and how we understood antidepressant medications to work. I'll talk more about Prozac later. But this chart is a really easy example of how different medications that are all prescribed for the same reason generally, some of them have like different fingers of purpose. In fact, many of them have different fingers of purpose, have different effects in terms of how they interact with your body. So a major one is the metabolization of it. So the half-life is really important here. Drugs that have a longer half-life will have a longer duration of action, and drugs that have a shorter half-life can cause withdrawal symptoms more easily because they're eliminated from your body faster. So if, for instance, you have someone that has really poor medication adherence, someone that is like super fucked up and depressed and they can barely get themselves to take their medication, you're probably going to want to prescribe them something with a longer half-life so that if they miss a dose, there's enough in their system to tide them over, basically. So something like Prozac is really good for this. It has a half-life of 4 to 6 days and 7 to 15 days for its active metabolite. I don't even know what the metabolite is. But that's crazy, you know, like to have Prozac fully out of your system, just like the drug itself fully out of your system, it's going to take 20 to 30 days for it to be completely eliminated. That's a long time, as opposed to something with a shorter half-life like paroxetine or sertraline. This is Zoloft. That would only take like 5 days to be out of your system. So that's a pretty, oh my God, what is the point of turning on Do Not Disturb? Can anyone answer this question for me? Like, why do I, oh no, please. Why do I even bother turning on Do Not Disturb? Because I still get those Discord notifications. So that's one reason, is the half-life is important. And then there's the interactions, like what other things will it butt heads with. And then other actions, like the different specific chemical mechanisms of action that a specific SSRI or antidepressant in general or drug will have. So if I remember correctly, actually, I think we'll come to it right now. Here are, I love this so much. It's a recent study that came out that identified a heat map of how different SSRIs or like antidepressants, these aren't actually all SSRIs, how different antidepressants share and don't share effects, which I think is crazy, like so cool in heat map form. And it's even bumblebee color, which is so fun. So you have sertraline right here, escitalopram right here, paroxetine, venlafaxine, fluvoxamine. These are like the classical SSRIs for the most part. You have pretty solid like consistency in that these are all going to be really active at the 5-HT transporter. So in the chat, yeah, it is sick. Yeah, and then there's Wellbutrin. Where is Wellbutrin on here? It's there it is. Bupropion is like Wellbutrin is a really odd bird. Wellbutrin, does anyone else have difficulty pronouncing this? Because every single time I like choke on myself, I choke on my tongue. Bupropion. Yeah, I think it's an SNDRI, I think. But I think it's a releasing agent. I think it's an SNDRA. I shouldn't find that out right now. Wellbutrin is like a really bizarre medication in terms of its interactions. Like Wellbutrin is one that has, if I'm remembering correctly, it's really similar to the cathinone class. Wellbutrin is basically bath salt. Like that's what it is. So I find it really interesting when people are like super aggressive about hating bath salts and they're like, bupropion saved my life. And it's like, it's just a bath salt, it's the cathinone. It's like a really similar mechanism. Yeah, it is a cathinone. So these were clustered into like the major SSRI effects, heavy activity at the 5-HT transporter. So for those of you that remember, the transporters are our vacuums. They are the cleanup agents of the synapse. So when a neurotransmitter is done doing its thing, the vacuum sucks it back up and it's repackaged to live another day inside of the cell. However, when you block that vacuum, there's more of that neurotransmitter available to bind in the synapse, which basically gives you more bang for your buck for each existing neurotransmitter that's floating around. It can do more with the time that it is given on this earth before it is destroyed because it can't get recycled. So, Wellbutrin may be violent. Whoa. Yeah, norepinephrine, dopamine reuptake inhibitor, and nicotinic receptor antagonist. Yep, it's a cathinone. Wah, substituted phenethylamines, which means that it is actually chemically kind of similar to MDMA. Haha. So are a lot of medications actually, because they're similar to serotonin. So that is like a good example of an odd bird in here. You can see it just is like this thing, receptor occupancy, basically means like proportion to the dose, how much of that thing is like occupied by this drug. So then there's something like doxepin. I don't remember what the actual brand name of doxepin is. That's the problem with getting into medication territory, is that it's like you don't have to just remember one name. You have to remember a billion names, because everything has a name and then a brand name and then maybe other brand names. And then maybe there's another name for it in another country. And then there's another brand name for it in another country. So it's not just enough for me to know what sertraline is, which I'm very proud of, by the way. I learned this like a week and a half ago and I've been using it ever since. But you need to know all of it. They demand so much of me. So you can generally categorize them into groups, and this gives you kind of an idea of what they will have some kind of an impact on. So like mirtazapine is a histamine receptor agonist. So this is like good information to have, because something like trazodone, for instance, it's not shown on here, but trazodone actually acts as a 5-HT2A receptor antagonist. Go, pop quiz. What might that mean? If you have a 5-HT2A receptor antagonist, what could that be used for potentially? Or what would the effect of that be interaction-wise? 5-HT2A antagonist. Yes, trip killer. That's right. Trazodone is generally pretty effective at stopping psychedelic experiences because it wedges the molecule of whatever is making you trip out of the 5-HT2A receptor. Not foolproof. I have a lot of disclaimers about that. In case of emergency, trazodone. Safer than antipsychotics, I would say, by quite a bit. Now, here's an interesting bit of psychology for you. It's something that is very often overlooked when people are talking about psychiatric medications or just pharmaceutical medications. The naming process for a drug is actually this very meticulously undergone process that sometimes takes years and goes through thousands of potential names. Now, this happens for the generic version of the drug, just like a new compound has been created. What do we call it? This is so exciting. Kind of, is anyone familiar with the Sonic the Hedgehog gene? How whoever discovers a gene can name it, and there was this guy that discovered a gene and named it the Sonic the Hedgehog gene because no one could stop him. So there's a gene in your body called the Sonic the Hedgehog gene. That's my fun fact for the day. So something like Celexa, and also Valium and Xanax and all kinds of other drugs, these were all named with extraordinary intention. And these are all brand names. So this isn't talking about the generic, which is a totally different nomenclature, which is also actually super loaded, that in ways that you might not know about. But these names were all designed to elicit a certain psychological response in people. Like the brand name industry of drugs is nefarious in how it intentionally tries to make their product more appealing by naming it strategically to elicit the feeling that you're going to get a certain thing out of it. So Val, like it's a root for Valiant and Valor and whatever, like, ooh, feel good, like be successful, ooh. And then Xanax, this is my favorite one to pick apart. It's a palindrome. It has the zzz sound on the before and after, traditionally affiliated with sleep and droning noises and white noise. Xanax, like how zen does that sound, And then something like Celexa is like this kind of sparkly fairy tale sensation. And then Prozac has a like none of this is accidental. None of it is accidental. There are whole committees that decide how to name these drugs based on similar things. Not to mention that V, X, and Y, and Z, I don't know why that's not in there, are way more frequently used in drug names than in anything else, partly to impart this feeling of like scientific value and validity to the substance because they're such uncommon letters in regular language, or in the English language, I mean. So a quick dive into the naming process, specifically the naming process of generic drugs, because this one is kind of wild.
All drugs have at least 3 names: the chemical name, the generic name, and at least one brand name. To confuse matters more, the same drug may have different brand and generic names in different countries. So everyone knows acetaminophen, right? It's also known as paracetamol. Acetaminophen and paracetamol are both generic names for the same drug. In the United States, we use the former. The most common brand name for that drug in the United States is Tylenol. Healthcare professionals will sometimes document use of this drug with the abbreviation APAP. This is derived from the drug's chemical name, N-acetyl-para-aminophenol. That's why brand and generic names are so handy. Nobody has time to say acetyl-para-amino whatever. Okay, so what's with all the crazy names? They don't seem to be chosen for ease of pronunciation. I mean, obinutuzumab? What? Some of these just sound like comic book characters. I would totally buy the issue where Valtrex Mevacorin on Dancitron or an epic fight to the death. They sound ridiculous, but when you consider the number of drugs out there, it's easier to understand why we have to come up with such, let's call them creative names. For safety reasons, drugs need to have distinctive spellings and pronunciations. As of 2013, the FDA had approved more than 1,450 drugs. That is an incredible number of unique names. I can't even think of 20 friends that all have different names. I'm pretty sure I know at least 10 Johns. So where do these names come from? Early in drug development, a pharmaceutical company may refer to a compound by its chemical name or an abbreviation. During phase 1 or phase 2 of the clinical trials, they'll apply for a generic or non-proprietary name. In the United States, this is done through the United States Adopted Name Council, or USANC, a group of pharmacists and physicians that represent various professional organizations and regulatory bodies. The council takes into account elements of the drug's chemistry and mechanism of action when assigning the name. Drugs with the same mechanism of action will have a common stem, usually at the end of the name. Take statins, for instance. Though they all have varying chemical structures and differ in the degree to which they'll lower cholesterol, Drugs like simvastatin, atorvastatin, and rosuvastatin all work the same way in the liver by inhibiting HMG-CoA reductase to reduce cholesterol biosynthesis. Another example are drugs that target viruses ending in vir, like valacyclovir, sometimes used for shingles or herpes, and tenofovir, which can be used for hepatitis B or in combination with other antivirals for HIV. But it's possible that other countries could give other names. Thankfully, the World Health Organization keeps everyone on the same page by managing and assigning international non-proprietary names, or INN. The WHO works closely with national naming commissions, like the USANC, to develop a suitable international non-proprietary name for a drug molecule. This takes a good deal of collaboration, but it's rare that an international non-proprietary name differs greatly from a national non-proprietary name. Oftentimes, the spelling of the international non-proprietary names is no different from country to country. When that's not possible, Latinized pronunciations are translated to other languages like Chinese, Russian, and Arabic. We haven't even discussed brand names. Again, the rules are different from country.
Okay, we don't have to finish that, but that's the gist, is that basically it's a really complicated process. Like, you might look at a brand name of a drug or a generic name and really take it for granted, but that is like the product of many,
All
many
drugs have at
years
least
of
3 names.
ridiculous levels of collaboration. Yeah, and I think that guy's funny too. So here are some major different kinds of antidepressants. And this is something that I'm sure that most of you are particularly interested in comparatively when it comes to medication substances, because these are the ones that we're going to see in terms of having interactions with things. So obviously it makes sense to know how they work. In the case of MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which we'll go over later today, these were like the first gen. These were like the original boys that came out when they weren't really popularly used because MAOIs have a lot of side effects. And then after that came TCAs, or tricyclic antidepressants, which also have generally quite a few side effects. And then we have tetracyclic and unicyclic antidepressants because they couldn't just do it in order and go unicyclic, duocyclic, tricyclic, and then tetracyclic, because that would be too easy. And then after that were SARIs, which are serotonin antagonist and reuptake inhibitors, which include things like trazodone. And that's what's so funky about trazodone, is it's actually a serotonin antagonist. And for an antidepressant, that's weird, right? Like, you'd expect that you would want to increase the levels of serotonin, not antagonize serotonin receptors. So it's just kind of a strange class within antidepressants. Like, I don't really fully understand how atypical antidepressants work, except for like their specific chemical mechanism, but we don't really understand how any of these antidepress you. We have a lot of theories, and some of them are more developed than others, but generally they rely on this thing called the monoamine hypothesis, which we'll talk about in a second. And then finally, we get around to the old and golden beloved SSRIs that most of us are familiar with, at least in some context, which are the ones like Zoloft and Prozac and Lexapro and whatever the most popular SSRIs are at the time. And then more recently, the most, aside from beloved ketamine, the most recent development in the antidepressant class was SNRIs. Although obviously there have been more developments after that, like releasing agents, for instance, and other substances that don't fully fall under these specific delineated categories. But SNRIs are serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, or as I like to say it when I'm feeling particularly obnoxious, norepinephrine. So SNRIs include things like Effexor and Pristiq, and their whole idea is basically that people that are really depressed have a hard time getting motivated and doing things. So give them a little boost of norepinephrine, because that's your fight or flight, and that will help you get going. Maybe not the best for like severe anxiety and panic, but I don't know quite enough about those prescribing tactics to really say. So we will talk about the potential ways that SSRIs, now we have arrived at the landing page for SSRIs, do their thing. So these are the most popularly prescribed medications in many different countries. SSRIs are extremely widely used in the US. Knowing what they do and do not interact with is important. Pop quiz: is there a high risk of serotonin syndrome from mixing SSRIs with psilocybin or LSD? Thanks, Hunter. I see no. Great. Yeah, pile them on. The answer has been revealed. Everyone's saying no in the chat. I want to see every single one of you just type no so that it's completely and totally homogenous. Thank you. So No, you can only submit one no. So SSRIs are generally prescribed for depression, but they can also be prescribed for anxiety and OCD and bulimia, and they have side effects, which is mainly the reason that people would not take them, even if it's been recommended that they do. So, one of the biggest, peskiest side effects is often decreased libido. Your sex drive usually plummets. Depending on the SSRI, this can be like noticeable and debilitating, or just kind of like mild and annoying, or maybe not even that much of an issue for you, but it's really common to have erectile dysfunction or difficulty with sexual performance on SSRIs. And then the issue of emotional numbness or decreased bone density in some cases, increased anxiety, weight gain, photosensitivity, which is light sensitivity, and mania. And that looks like a lot of side effects. It should be noted that SSRIs are a finicky, fickle class of drugs. Every single person is going to react to every single individual SSRI differently, which makes it so hard to find the right SSRI for the right person. One person that's prescribed one thing one time might go on it for like 2 months and be super miserable the whole time, and then try a different SSRI and have their life changed. So it's a difficult thing because you have to put up with going through many, many months often of adjustment to each medication, tapering off of one, starting the other, reporting in, going to therapy. Like, this is a real barrier to treating depression. This is why treating depression is so difficult and why it's so fucking awful to berate people for not being able to treat their own depression, because this process is almost never a click one and done. It's a difficult thing to get right. Now, here's the subject of the sexual dysfunction that I'd mentioned prior. And when I first did this slide, this was just supposed to be like an face, like an emoji. Oh, I hate saying that out loud. But someone pointed out that it looked like I was saying SSRIs, orgasms 0, which I thought was funny. So I haven't changed it, even though the formatting is now super ugly and not very effective at conveying the idea behind it. So this is showing the difference between bupropion, which is Wellbutrin, and I'm kind of irritated that I've made myself say it so many times because I'm not getting better at it each time, and I feel like it's obvious. And compared to the orgasm suppression, basically orgasm dysfunction of fluoxetine, which is Prozac, versus placebo. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious here that, like, damn, Prozac really kills your sexy time. That sucks. And then Wellbutrin might actually increase your ability to orgasm, depending. So it's this really is like it's no laughing matter. Like, it really can fuck with people's romantic lives if they're on SSRIs. Like, people don't take them for this reason, which is rough. Yeah, I think is it anorgasmia? Yeah. Emoticon and emote. Oh. So SSRIs generally work by this chemical mechanism of reuptake inhibition. We're familiar with this. We don't have to talk about it too much. The point is that you have the serotonin here, you have the transporter here, and SSRI wedges itself in there like a sweet golden corn dog of serotonin, and all of a sudden you have more serotonin available to bind in the synapse. Oh no, the vacuum can't vacuum. Similar to our vacuum in our house, which we took the bag out of 2 months ago and then used that as an excuse to not clean our house for 2 months. So some reasons that we think that SSRIs take a while to work, because most SSRIs, well, pretty much all of the time, it takes 4 to 8 weeks to really start feeling antidepressant effects from taking SSRIs. Again, this is super inaccessible, and this makes it really hard for people to get treatment a lot of the time. A lot of people will discover that after the first 1 or 2 weeks, they start seeing some kind of a change in their symptoms, but it generally really does take quite a while for the effects to super kick in, and another 4 to 6 months approximately until they really take off. So the question is why? Why, Rachel? Why is this the case? And we have a couple of potential answers. The first is that over time, in response to this excess of serotonin in the synapse, your brain decides to stop making as many transporters to repackage it, basically. It's like, okay, I don't think that these transporters are really doing much for me right now, so I'm just going to stop making as many of them. It makes a change in the way that your brain actually handles and produces its own materials so that you have a natural SSRI effect going forward, meaning that there are fewer transporters to suck up serotonin and recycle it, which means that the abundance of serotonin is magnified in the synapse. That's one potential theory. The other is the gradual growth of new neurons, which is otherwise known as neurogenesis. And neurogenesis is thought to be the basis of a lot of things, basically regrowing thought patterns. And if you have more neurons available to do the work, then you have more of an ability to kind of craft neural pathways and to solve complex problems. So that's theory number 2. And then the third is inflammation reduction. And this is an interesting one because inflammation is actually thought to be one of the major bases of a lot of psychiatric conditions, specifically depression. But inflammation sucks. Like, it makes your body way less bodyable. It's very difficult for it to function when it is inflamed, which is why eating anti-inflammatory diets can be really helpful to a surprising and very serious degree for a lot of people who have chronic illness or just who aren't feeling well. Changing your diet, it's so cliche, but it's like that, it like actually it changes the way that you are inflamed on the inside. Like, eating a lot of starches, it's inflammatory, period. That's just how it works. So it depends on the starch, but still. Now for the fantastic and dreaded interactions section of SSRIs, which is like the biggest oh my god, I can just imagine like the number one Google search of 2020 was, will my SSRI that I just started taking interact with all of my rave drugs that I want to do at home? So let's pick that apart right now, specifically looking at MDMA for serotonin syndrome. Now, it is super commonly believed that if you mix, and I know that I've said this before at a past lecture, but just to reiterate, it is super commonly believed that mixing an SSRI with MDMA is like the ultimate recipe for serotonin syndrome. Like, mix SSRI with MDMA, you will get it. Oh, why would you do that? That's so irresponsible, etc. But that just isn't actually necessarily the biggest risk here. There are risks to it, obviously, because it's mixing a medication with anything generally will have some level of risk, even if it's really negligible. Like, all drug use is inherently risky, period, no matter what, no matter how prepared you are, including taking Tylenol. But the thing that will usually happen here is that you're just not going to feel the MDMA. So people will try and take triple, quadruple, quintuple, sextuple. What is the seventuple? Is it septuple, octuple, neuntuple? Zane. Is that how you say 10 in German? I have to stay on track. I'm sorry. So that's the whole thing, is that if you're taking a shitload of MDMA, then taking a shitload of MDMA in general is probably not fantastic for you. If you do it and you're also on an SSRI, then there's a chance that there could be complications, like your seizure threshold being drastically lowered, or the toxic metabolites finding their ways into your neurons, even though we don't really know if that can happen if you're on an SSRI because the transporters are blocked, or like any other number of things. It's just like taking a lot of any drug increases the likelihood of something going wrong. But you're probably not going to get serotonin syndrome from mixing an SSRI, well, specifically a classical SSRI, not necessarily an atypical antidepressant with MDMA. Always do research on the individual one, but you're probably just not going to roll. It might just not be worth it at all. And it's not worth it to just keep upping the dose. And then MAOIs, super dangerous to mix. Lithium, super dangerous to mix. DXM can also get serotonin syndrome from this, and opioids as well in some cases. And these are just like, I hope that this serves as an example for you just can't generalize that easily. Like, you need to look up the individual interaction for individual substances, even though some, like, you should use it like a test kit. Like, some classes of drugs are like an immediate red flag of like, do not touch. And others are like, you should probably look at the individual drug, no matter what. Then you have NSAIDs, and mixing NSAIDs with SSRIs can cause an increased risk of bleeding, which sucks. So like aspirin, naproxen, ibuprofen, these are all things. Aspirin. Should aspirin be on there? I don't think aspirin should actually be on there. Naproxen and ibuprofen for sure are NSAIDs that you should not mix because they can increase your risk of bleeding. So I've actually known a couple of people in the past whose psychiatrists have been like, oh, you can just stop taking your SSRI. It's fine. But you can't. You can't do that because you will have a fucking withdrawal from it, because antidepressant discontinuation syndrome is a thing. And obviously this is dose dependent and duration dependent and all kinds of stuff. Like, the longer you take it, the more you're taking, the worse it's going to be. But it's just like, don't tell someone that they can just stop taking their SSRIs. That could be really uncomfortable for like weeks. You could have brain zaps and brain fog and like feelings of sadness or even being suicidal. And like, it just sucks. Like, you should do a physician assisted taper. And this can last for, like I said, weeks. In fact, sometimes it can even last longer than that if you're very unfortunate. The longer your half-life of your substance, the easier it's going to be to withdraw from, because your body has so much time to overlap, as opposed to a really short half-life where you need to continuously take it. Now, here is this in action. This is a really complicated animated thing that I made that I loved. And every year I look at it, I'm like, this is so complicated. But here's basically why you will withdraw. Okay, so here we have Prozac stuck in the transporter, right? This is the vacuum. Raise your hand if this looks scary. I can't see who's raising. I can't actually see any of you. I just hope that someone raised their hand, because it'd be cool if this were intimidating. So here's Prozac wedged into the transporter, right? And here is serotonin hitting the synapse. And because of this, the serotonin receptors withdraw into the skin of that next neuron, because they're like, wow, that's a lot of serotonin. Receptors should probably pull back for a minute. We're not really sure about this. There's a lot happening. So we're just going to make there be fewer receptors available, because there's a lot of serotonin, more than we're used to. Now, over time, if you take the SSRI away, you're going to have a bunch of serotonin here, and then that is going to slow. I don't actually understand this diagram. We're going to go away from it. Anyway, the point is that you're going to withdraw. So don't do that super suddenly. I should have looked at that. I was like, this makes sense. I remember this, but I just don't really know what I was trying to say there. Electrical pulses from the Zoloft you quit in 2013. Yeah, man, it's rough. It's rough. So there are a lot of ethical questions around SSRIs, obviously. Like, everyone has something to say about them. But Prozac was really the one, I think in the 80s, I think it was in the 80s, where it just blew up in popularity. It was the first antidepressant to be really marketable as being like a wonder drug. It was referred to as a wonder drug. Now, Prozac has been shown to be medium helpful for people with moderate to severe depression, but if you have mild or situational depression, a lot of antidepressants just won't do that much for you, or could give you negative side effects. So that's just like the thing that we're currently dealing with right now in terms of figuring out how to go about this. And in fact, we've seen this new rise in SNRIs, serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, which has more of an emphasis on giving you that get up and go kind of deal. And we're seeing pretty high effectiveness in SNRIs compared to SSRIs. But again, it's just not for everyone. Like, these all have to be tailored. And the fact that these are the only antidepressant options on the market right now, like, we have a big niche to fill, which is why everyone is fucking shitting their pants about ketamine. Every doctor is like, oh, a new antidepressant? It's been so long. Now, looking at the effectiveness of them, this is just kind of from like a global study that showed approximately 20 to 40% of people who took placebo noticed an improvement in their symptoms within a month and a half to 2 months. 40 to 60% that took SSRIs, or an antidepressant, but probably usually SSRIs, noticed symptom improvements. So this is like, it's like a, what, 30% increase or something from this, maybe 50% increase, a little less than that, 45 or no deal, 40 or no deal. I won't negotiate any further. And then looking in terms of relapse, approximately half of the people that got placebo relapsed at some point, whereas approximately a quarter of the people that took antidepressants relapsed. So there is some evidence showing that, like, antidepressants are like moderately effective at what they do for certain groups of people. But unfortunately, they're just like, they're not as effective as they could be. And the fact that more than half of people generally who take an antidepressant don't really notice an improvement in their symptoms is like, that's really kind of major. Um, and it's not to say that SSRIs and antidepressants aren't very effective, because they really can be. They can completely change people's lives. But this speaks kind of to the fact that people haven't really had access to ongoing healthcare in addition to their prescriptions of SSRIs. And that speaks to the American healthcare system. Tramadol is an SSRI. Yeah, tramadol has so many interactions. Mixing tramadol with most things is super dangerous. Okay, now moving on to MAOIs. These are not very commonly prescribed, but if someone is prescribed an MAOI, but also, like, for those of you that are into psychedelics, this is relevant for that. If someone is prescribed an MAOI and they don't know about interactions, this could like save their lives, because knowing about MAOI interactions is major. So generally they'll be prescribed for depression, sometimes panic disorder, social phobia, bipolar depression, and this is the first generation antidepressant. These have been largely phased out in favor of better tolerated ones. Now they're kind of used as a last line of defense. But one of the biggest things about MAOIs is that they can cause hypertensive crisis, which is a catastrophic increase in blood pressure at the drop of a hat. Like, they have pretty fucking severe interactions with things, to the point where people have to watch their diets on them, which can be really difficult for a depressed person who is trying to feed themselves, where they don't have the ability to just like eat what they need to, which is rough. We've seen this before. MAO, monoamine oxidase, it can be thought of like a hammer or a bouncer. It goes around and it smashes up extra neurotransmitters that are floating around. It's like, fuck you, we don't need you anymore. I'm so alone. And then monoamine oxidase, which we will envision as this hug, fluffy creature, hugs the MAO molecules. It basically crushes them and prevents them from doing their jobs. It's like, no, we're going to let them run free, honey. Let them grow up. Let them be big and strong in the wilderness like they need to. And the MAO is like, I can't do anything about this, so I guess we're going to do that. That means more neurotransmitters is basically what that ends up looking like. Now, there are two kinds of MAOIs. There is a reversible MAOI and there is an irreversible MAOI. So the reversible MAOI is a kind of medication that hugs that hammer and is like, no, shh, don't destroy anything. It is so much more beautiful to build than to destroy. But then the irreversible MAOI hugs and is like, shh, this is the last moment that you draw breath, and kills it. So that's the difference between them, is that the reversible MAOI hugs for a while and then ultimately lets go. And the MAO enzyme is like, that was fucking weird, and floats off to continue doing whatever it's doing of killing your neurotransmitters that you don't need. Whereas the irreversible MAOI will permanently destroy them. Now that means that after you stop taking MAOIs, you still need about 2 full weeks to actually recover the MAO that has been destroyed in this process. And this is something that is a commonly missed thing when people are talking about how they can dose something like MDMA, because if you have destroyed your natural supply of MAO, then you're going to not only need to taper off your medication, but also wait a full 2 weeks so that your naturally occurring MAO build up again in your system. So if you know someone that's on an MAOI and they're like, oh, I'll just take like 4 or 5 days off and I can do this, ask them if it's reversible or irreversible. And if they don't know, you can find out and tell them. Okay. Now, just a quick recap of all these things.
One popular way to treat depression is with antidepressants. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or MAOIs, tricyclic antidepressants, or TCAs, and selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. So let's start off with these MAOIs. And the clue to how these antidepressants work is in the name. Monoamine oxidase is an enzyme that breaks down neurotransmitters that isn't stored in vesicles. So it's kind of like cellular housekeeping. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors are drugs that inhibit the actions of monoamine oxidase. So by inhibiting this enzyme, it actually increases the amount of neurotransmitter that is capable of being released into the synapse. And more neurotransmitters in the synapse increases the likelihood that they will dock onto the postsynaptic cell and cause an action potential.
That means fire. That means do it. That means feel serotonin or whatever the neurotransmitter is.
The next type of antidepressants are tricyclic antidepressants. And instead of being named for what they do, these drugs are named for how they look. And I have a few examples here. And you can tell that all of them have this 3-ring structure. So tri for 3 and cyclic for the rings. And tricyclics work by increasing the levels of 2 specific neurotransmitters, norepinephrine and serotonin. But the way that they do this is very different from MAOIs. Instead of stopping an enzyme from breaking down these neurotransmitters, TCAs work by interfering with a very different housekeeping mechanism called reuptake. So much like you, your body likes to recycle. It likes to be efficient. And this is even true at the neuronal level. After the neurotransmitter has released into the synapse, your body doesn't get rid of it. Instead, it recycles it by taking it back up into the presynaptic cell through these reuptake channels. And then it can be repackaged into vesicles and released again. TCAs work by blocking these reuptake channels. And the result of this is that the neurotransmitter stays in the synapse longer, which then increases the likelihood that it will dock onto a receptor on the postsynaptic cell and trigger an action potential.
So you might be saying, Rackle, why aren't these considered to just be SSRIs? Because they're serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And the answer is that SSRI is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It only inhibits reuptake of certain kinds of serotonin, and in some cases acts on other areas of the brain as well. So TCAs not only have their own unique chemical structure, but they also influence the reuptake of norepinephrine and serotonin, which means that they're not selective to serotonin. Selective means that they pick and choose what they want to block the reuptake for.
SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they work the same way. They work by blocking reuptake channels. But instead of blocking them for both norepinephrine and serotonin like TCAs, they only block reuptake for serotonin, and only for very specific serotonin receptors. So like MAOIs, here we have a situation where the name of the drug is a description of what the drug does.
Okay. Now, here's where, as promised, we can get into the psychedelic territory. So DMT in particular, this is the B-capivine. This is an MAOI containing vibe, that is used in brewing ayahuasca. There are several MAOI containing plants that can be used to brew ayahuasca, but the reason for it is that in your body, including Syrian rue, in your body, DMT, which is the active component of ayahuasca, gets broken down by MAO. As soon as you ingest it in your gut, it's wrecked. It's not going to work. But if you introduce an MAOI into the system, then your natural defenses against DMT are not going to work, basically. You say, shh, no, let it pass through. So by introducing a reversible MAOI, you basically give your body the green light to allow DMT to be absorbed into the system. Kind of like knocking out prison guards, like that scene in Kung Fu Panda. And I always reference that, and I don't think anyone ever identifies with it. So specifically with MDMA, this is kind of an issue of you are preventing the breakdown of serotonin, which means that there will be a lot of serotonin because MDMA releases a lot of serotonin. MAO would usually be involved in cleaning up the serotonin, but instead it's just allowed to run free through your land and wreak absolute euphoric havoc on your body. Unfortunately, this definitely caps out after a point where you inevitably will experience serotonin syndrome, which is a major fucking bummer if you're rolling face at EDC and you've decided that you want to allow excessive serotonin to accumulate in the synapse, therefore overloading your system. Uncomfortable. There they are. Now, foods are the funkiest part of MAOIs. There's this substance called tyramine that's found in a lot of foods, including things like ham and champagne and pineapple and cheese and peanuts and chocolate and soy sauce and bananas and snap peas and avocados. Oh my God, imagine trying to avoid everything that contains tyramine. Now, this is a really big issue because usually tyramine, which is a blood pressure raising substance, is broken down in your body by MAO. If you inhibit the activity of MAO in your body, you increase the hypertension caused by these foods. So hypertensive crisis is a really, really, really serious byproduct of MAOIs, specifically combining MAOIs even with things as innocuous as avocados. And this is something that people really need to look out for when they're prescribed them. Uh-oh. Okay, let's take a look at the numbers. These graphs, believe it or not, are actually from the CDC, but they look like I took a picture of them with the Nokia phone. So I just want to tell you that these are valid graphs. I didn't just scrape them off the internet somewhere. I mean, I did, but from a really real source. So the vast majority of people that are prescribed antidepressants are white people, non-Hispanic white people, followed by Black people, followed by Hispanic people, followed by non-Hispanic Asian people. And this, I think, says quite a bit in a lot of different areas. And in one area is that there is a history. Well, there are so many reasons why this is the case. Partially cultural, partially mistrust of the medical systems, because medical systems have institutionalized racism for so many years. And that leads into one of the other parts, which is that medical providers have actually been shown in many cases, because the vast majority of doctors are white, to actually have an inherent biased belief that their constituents of color do not feel as much pain. That is a real thing. that has been shown in medical providers. So there's a lot of mistrust in the system, right? Like there has been a history of American healthcare experimenting on populations of color and using them as guinea pigs for experimental medications and basically like forced treatment. So of course there is a lower amount of trust in the system, aside from any cultural concerns with taking antidepressant medications, aside from stigmas around taking antidepressant medications. Like this is, you know, a reflection of a lot of racism that has been inherent in American healthcare for a super, super long time. But then in addition to that, we see that there's this like interesting gender imbalance. And this is obviously non-inclusive of non-gender conforming individuals, which is like a major problem with all reporting about drugs, right? But it is like a vast discrepancy between men and women, or like AFAB individuals, AMAB individuals who are taking antidepressants. It's like a staggering difference. Women are super, super likely to be on antidepressants compared to men, whatever that means in the binary, you know what I mean? But then there's also this question of like education. And interestingly, it's kind of across the board. The higher level of education a person has, the more likely they are to be on antidepressants in a non-insignificant way statistically. What does this mean? Well, I don't really fully know because I'm not an anthropologist, but there are a lot of potential reasons why this could be the case. Again, it could be an issue of having the access to healthcare and resources to even get a prescription in the first place. It could have to do with having the accessibility of healthcare resources nearby because living in more affluent areas allow for this. Like really hire an anthropologist for that one to really make sense of it. And then we look at this trend, this exponentially increasing trend. Actually, that's pretty linear. It's not exponential, but we're seeing a massively increasing trend of prescriptions of antidepressants. And this is like a really serious upward line. You know, we're seeing massive, massive numbers of people being prescribed antidepressants across the spectrum. And there are so many questions to be asked here of like, is this ethical? Is this effective? Are people actually more depressed now than they were? Is mental health being less stigmatized? Are people finding that they're able to access these medications more easily than they were? Like, what exactly is the reason for this? Now, a quick dive into the difference between a typical or an atypical antidepressant. A typical antidepressant will act on serotonin predominantly. This includes the classes of SSRIs, TCAs, which is tricyclic antidepressants, MAOIs, and SNRIs, examples of which are Celexa, Lexapro, Prozac, Paxil, like the brand name, typical SSRI kind of shit. Then we get into the atypical SSRIs, which basically include things that aren't just serotonin or norepinephrine agonists. So examples would be Wellbutrin or trazodone, which I'd mentioned earlier, mirtazapine, which is Remeron. Did you guys notice that I intentionally didn't say bupropion? Because I noticed, and I feel like I just have to expose myself to it and say it as much as possible. So atypical antidepressants have totally different mechanisms of action than typical antidepressants. And therefore, just because someone is on an antidepressant, it doesn't actually really necessarily tell you what their interactions could be. So that's good to know. You know, I'm actually going to stop class a little early today because I didn't comprehensively review this section and I want to make sure it doesn't contain anything stigmatizing. For some reason, I thought we weren't going to get there today. So, short class. I will stick around for 60 seconds afterwards to answer questions, and otherwise I will see you guys on Thursday and have a great night.